Now, the heart of the resource-based view is its effort to answer the question, what type of resources can help a company to generate a sustained competitive advantage? And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are particular characteristics of resources that will make them either helpful or unhelpful to a company in generating a sustained competitive advantage. Now, I've asked you to read an article on this topic by David Collis and Cynthia Montgomery. The article was called Competing on Resources. And in that article, they basically boil this question down to 3 sub-questions. Those 3 questions are as follows. First, there's the question of demand. And there the question is, how large of an advantage does the resource provide? If this is a resource that's intended to give you a cost advantage, the question is, how much of a cost savings does it provide to the company? Because that will determine how much room the company will have to undercut the price of competitors and offer customers a better deal. On the other hand, if it's a resource that's intended to help the company to differentiate its product, the question again is, how large of a differentiation advantage does that resource provide? The second question is the question of scarcity. And this question is designed to get at how sustainable of an advantage does a resource provide to a company. And the reason why scarcity is related to sustainability is that if the resource isn't scarce, if it's not scarce, that is, if it's freely available to anybody who wants to get it, then any advantage that you have from owning it will be competed away as other companies gain the same resource. The question of scarcity determines how sustainable an advantage is. If the resource is more scarce, if it has a less elastic supply in the market, then a company can hope that can have reason to hope that it will provide a more sustainable advantage. The third question is the question of appropriation. And you may have a resource that provides a large advantage and a sustainable advantage, but if you are not able to keep the profits that that resource generates, then it's of very little use to you. It will not actually provide you with a profit advantage. So that's the question of appropriation. Who actually gets to keep the profits that are generated by a resource? You might think that the profits that are generated by a resource will always go to the owner of that resource, but that's not always the case, and we're going to discuss that in a few minutes. So what I'm going to do next is to go through each of these 3 questions in detail and examine what's entailed by them. But the point I want to make for now is illustrated by the following figure, which is included in the Collis and Montgomery article on competing on resources. This figure, which they show in their article, demonstrates the point that in order for a resource to generate a sustained profit advantage for a company, 3 conditions have to be met. The resource has to provide a big advantage in terms of satisfying demand, either through making your product more attractive to the customer than other competing products are in order to differentiate your product, or through giving you a lower cost of producing that product so that you have room to undercut your competitors in price. That's the demand piece. But it also has to be a resource that's scarce so that other competitors in the market can't very easily get their hands on that same resource or a similar resource or a substitute resource, and thereby compete away the advantages that you have because you have that resource. And third, you have to be able to keep the profits that are generated by the resource. Appropriation has to work in your favor. And so Collis and Montgomery say that that intersection of the demand, scarcity, and appropriation questions is what they call the value creation zone. If you've got a good answer to all 3 of those questions, then that resource that we're talking about can generate a sustained competitive advantage for you. Otherwise, it probably won't be able to generate a sustained competitive advantage for you. So what I'm going to do next is go through each of these three circles, each of these three questions in greater detail, and we're going to use that Xerox Palo Alto Research Center example to illustrate some of the points of the obstacles that are in the way of any company trying to create a sustained competitive advantage. Okay, let's start with that demand question, the question of how large of an advantage does a resource provide in terms of serving customers' needs. The question here is, does it satisfy a real market need? Does it, enable the customer to do something better, faster, cheaper in some way? Because, as the old saying goes, it makes no sense to do the wrong thing perfectly. If there is not a real market need, it doesn't matter how good you are at serving a non-existent need. No matter how good your resources are and your capabilities, no matter how good your resources and capabilities are, if they cannot serve a real market need, it does not provide an advantage. Now, here the question is, let's think about the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center Alto computer. One might argue that one of the reasons why Xerox did not succeed at becoming a dominant player in the personal computer industry was that perhaps they were too early to market, and that the market did not yet recognize the need for the product. Xerox was so far ahead of the rest of the world in technology and so far ahead of its time that it really was not clear at the time whether there would actually be a market for the kind of computer that Xerox had developed at the Palo Alto Research Center. It was not clear whether people would buy something as expensive and as complicated as a computer to serve the functions that were already being adequately served at the time by much less expensive and much simpler technologies like the typewriter, the telephone, the filing cabinet, and the photocopier. Ultimately, over the following decades, it did become clear, of course, that there would indeed be a huge market need for such a computer system. But at the time, in the mid-1970s, it was not at all clear that the market would be willing to pay so much more to fulfill needs that were already being adequately fulfilled by cheaper and simpler technologies. Indeed, from the perspective of the mid-1970s, a product like the Xerox Alto might have been viewed as the equivalent of using a cannon to swat a fly. The problem is that some market needs are always latent, and the market itself may not recognize its own needs clearly, especially if the market is not aware of what's possible. In the mid-1970s, the market did not understand what a personal computer was, or what it could do, or what applications it might be used for, and so the market would not easily have recognized the need for it. Ultimately, what Xerox would have needed to do in order to crack this market and to guarantee that the market would recognize the need for the product would have been to embark on a substantial educational initiative, investing in educating the public and educating the market about what a personal computer was, what it could do, and what it could be used for. Xerox didn't invest in educating the market this way. The company that did make this investment in educating the market was Apple Computer. Apple launched an aggressive initiative to educate the world about what a personal computer was, including giving large numbers of computers to schools at little or no cost, in the hope that the students of today would eventually become the corporate technology buyers of tomorrow. As a result of its massive efforts to educate the world about personal computing, Apple did reap some huge benefits, and Apple became the early market share leader in the personal computer industry, at least until IBM entered the market around 1981. Another determinant of how large an advantage a resource or capability can provide for a company is competitive superiority, the question of competitive superiority. For Xerox, it was fairly clear that their technology was vastly superior to what any other computer technology was at the time. However, it's not always so clear, as in this case. The critical question is whether your company's resources and capabilities are really demonstrably better than those of your competitors. As Collis and Montgomery said in their Competing on Resources article, which I've asked you to read, they said, quote, "Perhaps the greatest mistake that managers make when evaluating their company's resources is that they do not assess them relative to competitors. Core competence has too often become a feel-good exercise that no one fails. Every company can identify one activity that it does relatively better than other activities and claim that as its core competence. Unfortunately, core competence should not be an internal assessment of which activity out of all of its activities the company performs best. Rather, it should be a harsh external assessment of what the company does better than competitors, for which the term distinctive competence is more appropriate. How many consumer packaged goods companies assert that their core competence is consumer marketing skills? They may indeed all be good at that activity, but a corporate strategy built on such a core competence will run into trouble because other competitors with better skills will be pursuing the same strategy," unquote. That's what Collis and Montgomery said about this. And so the question is, how would you ever know whether your resources and capabilities are better than those of competitors? Well, this is where a little competitor intelligence can go a long way. Ask those who would know best. Ask your customers. Ask your competitors' customers. Ask your suppliers. Ask your competitors' suppliers. Also, tap into the professional networks of your people. Specialist professionals within your company, people like engineers or salespeople or marketers, those specialists frequently have relationships with their counterparts who do similar jobs at competing companies. They may have gone to school together, or they may know each other through professional associations or through conferences, but regardless of how they know each other, it's a professional relationship that can be used to gather information about the strengths and weaknesses of competitors relative to your company.